So welcome to Philosophy, Food and Ethical Eating. My name's Nin Kirkham and this is Michael Rubin. We're both from philosophy in the School of Humanities. So the way that it's going to work today is I'm going to talk to you a little bit about general issues to do with the ethics of food and show you lots of pictures. And then Ruby's going to give some philosophical arguments about the ethics of food and eating. So the title of my part of the talk today is How We Should Think About How We Should Eat. And the short answer that I'm going to give to that question is probably unsurprisingly that we should do so wisely. We should think wisely about how we eat. So while I'm going to touch on issues concerning food and what philosophy can say about those issues, both Ruby and I are also going to try and give you some sense of why doing some philosophy units as part of your degree might be useful to you both in your academic work and in your life more generally. So I believe that even if you have no inclination to become a philosopher, and I think that's probably a good sign, learning some philosophy and doing some philosophy at university makes you a lot better at thinking clearly, at reasoning, at assessing arguments and dealing with the onslaught of information that we have to cope with. And perhaps more importantly, at putting into practice what you value and being clear about what that is. So the subject matter of philosophy can be really wide-ranging. We do lots of different things in philosophy. It's like we never get this many people in our classes. It's great. No, some of them we do. So yeah, the subject matter that philosophy covers is enormously wide-ranging. So we talk about knowledge and religion and ethics and bioethics and justice and a whole range of different logic. But in general, something you could say, and Ruby might dispute me on this, but we do a lot of that, philosophy is different from the empirical or scientific disciplines in that a lot of what we focus on concerns not how things are, but how things should be. So scientific disciplines tend to be interested in discovering how the physical world works and finding out facts, and in some sense describing how the world is. Now, it's not that philosophers aren't interested in the discoveries of science or in finding out facts about how the world is, just that we're primarily interested in normative rather than descriptive questions. And by normative, I mean answering questions about, again, not how things are, but how they should be. So what we should do, what we should think. And there are other disciplines, law is one that springs to mind, that are also interested in normative questions. But the two things that in philosophy we're particularly interested in, or two things that we are, I wouldn't limit it, are in reasoning, so working out how we should think and how we should reason, and ethics, so working out what we should do. So those two things, thinking about how we should think and thinking about what we should do, form one of the backbones of the philosophical approach. So you can see again that the title I've given my part of the talk today suggests a focus on both these questions about, how we should do things. But you also might notice that I'm not talking about what we should eat, but how we should eat. And this is because unlike a lot of philosophers, and I think my dear friend Ruby is one of them, I'm the kind of philosopher who argues that the focus of our ethical thinking should at least be partly on questions about how we should be as people, rather than what we should or shouldn't do. So I'm what they call a virtue ethicist, someone who thinks it's important that we focus as much on character in ethics or the development of character traits that orient us to be the kinds of people we want to be and to be disposed to act in the world in certain ways. I think that's just as important as thinking about particular prohibitions or prescriptions about what we shouldn't do. So I think it's important not just to just say that we should eat this or we shouldn't eat that, but to give a general account of how we should be disposed towards food. And not just eating it, but its production and its distribution too. So in thinking that the dispositions of character are central to ethics, I follow the ancient Greek philosopher, very old-fashioned, Aristotle and his contemporaries, who thought that the primary aim of thinking about ethics, of ethical reflection, is to help you see that the good life, the life of happiness, the life of flourishing, and what the Greeks called this the life of eudaimonia, is one where you strive to be virtuous, to possess the character traits of a good human being. Now, at the foundation of the development of the virtues lies the development of something that the Greeks called practical wisdom, which is, in essence, the ability to use your practical reason, to decide what to do, to know how to do it, and to have the will to put it into practice, to actually do it. So the life of a person who possesses practical wisdom is one where our reasoning is well developed. So that's one of the things we teach in philosophy, how to reason. And our emotional responses to situations, so our desires, broadly speaking, are brought into line with our considered judgments about things. So the virtuous person, the person with a good character, is a person who possesses practical wisdom. They both know what they should do and they desire to do it. So those two things are brought together. And the person with practical wisdom possesses both the virtues of the intellect, sometimes known as the epistemological virtues, so the virtues concerning how we go about gaining knowledge. Things like intellectual humility might be part of those, consistency, critical acumen, and the virtues of character as well. So in respect to food and eating, these might be things like moderation or mindfulness or hospitality or care, thrift perhaps. But the general idea is that in order to develop practical wisdom, the wisdom that we need to live a good life, we need to learn to reason well, that is, to learn how we should think, and to act well, what we should do and how we should do it. So you might be thinking, how does all this bear on the question of food? How can this practical wisdom you speak of help us to think about issues to do with food? So the first thing you might have noticed when you're thinking about how we should eat is just how pervasive food is in our lives. And I know some of you have been to seminars today to talk about different aspects of food and food science. But for all of recorded history in every society, humans have placed cultural and religious prescriptions on what and when we should and shouldn't eat. So food and eating has always been and always will be a profoundly moral issue. Cooking and eating are pivotal to our understanding and perpetuation of culture. They're central to our lives as individuals, our conceptions of our roles as individuals, as members of families, as members of societies and so on. How we make a living, our lifeways, are usually founded on the way that we produce food and the way that kinds of cultural and religious prescriptions that we place on food, they're really essential to our understanding of our culture and our lifeways. So in the modern Western developed world, our culture around food has become less dominated by ethico, kind of cultural and religious concerns, and much more about health and well-being. But at the same time that that's happened, that shift has happened, our food production, our food distribution and our consumption has become dominated by an industrial paradigm. So food's become an industry. And the industrialisation of food is an unavoidably moral issue. So the moment that you start thinking about the ethics of food, the morality of food, you realise that there are just so many issues. So I'm just going to give you a small selection of them, and then Ruby's going to talk to you in detail about some of them. So you might be concerned about the welfare of animals. You might be worried about eating animals. You might be a vegetarian, you might be a vegan. But you might think, well, even if it's okay to kill animals for food, if we're going to eat animals, their lives should be more like this, and less like this, and this. I probably should have given a trigger warning about some of these images. You might be worried about environmental issues, not just animal rights or animal welfare issues. So you might be worried about the environmental effects of the way that we produce food, whether it be the environmental effects of ranching and the loss of South American rainforests for the production of beef. You might be worried about broadacre monocultural cropping and its increased use of genetically modified and Roundup-ready crops. That might lead you to be concerned about the overuse of insecticides and the effect, for instance, of neonicotinoids on bee populations and the enormous decline in bee populations. You might be worried about the palm oil industry and the effect that the demand for palm oil is having on Sumatran rainforests and their populations of endangered orangutans. You might be worried about the overuse of plastic packaging and its environmental effects, or the amount of plastic rubbish that's finding its way into the oceans. You might be concerned about eating fish because of mercury, and now because of microplastics in the food chain, or because of fishery sustainability, overfishing, or even because of the social justice aspects of fishing practice, which in many parts of the world involve slavery. And unfortunately, it's not just the international fishing industry which is problematic with respect to human rights abuse and slavery. Even the humble cherry tomato grown in Perth has recently been linked to immigration worker exploitation and allegations of slavery. These are from my garden, so they're okay, they're legit. You might be concerned about the long-term food security of the international situation. You might be worried about food waste and the amount of food that it just doesn't even leave the farm gate because it's not perfect and gets rejected by the buyers. You might be worried about the absurd and unjust contrast between what's going on in the developing world with respect to food and what's going on in the developed world. You might have concerns about the influence of the food industry and its lobby groups on the development of government policy, the behaviour of the fast food industry. You might just be worried about what you should be eating in order to be physically healthy. And there's a huge controversy about that because there's so much information available and so much fashion that dominates what people think about these things. So one thing is for sure is that there's a whole range of issues concerning what we should eat and why, and we're inundated with information. Okay, it's so full on. There's a nice picture about the things that people think they should eat. If you follow Instagram, you'll see stuff like that all the time. Okay, it's so full on, sometimes it feels like your head's going to explode. That everything you buy and everything you eat is laden with these set of moral issues that you have to think about. And in the face of all of that, you know, all of this information that we get, which is often conflicting and confusing, how can we ever decide what we should eat, how we should eat? And it's tempting in the face of all this to respond with a kind of overwhelmed despondency, a kind of I can't care, it's just too much, there's too much to think about, I can't deal with it. And what would, you know, the changes that I could make, how would they affect anything anyway? So what could I do as an individual? And that's a good question. So there are lots of things you can do as an individual, but you can also change your behaviour. And I'm not going to argue that changing one individual's behaviour is enough to solve any of these issues. Not crazy. But I do want to argue that individuals becoming more practically wise about how they reach their decisions, about what they should eat and what products they should buy, is one important way to begin to address some of these problems. I'm definitely not saying it's the only way, but consumer behaviour can make a real difference to the way that food producers and the food businesses conduct themselves. So it's one of the very small powers that we have to respond to the food industry, because demand, of course, affects supply. We know that. So just as a couple of examples, consider the fairly well documented, these days it's talked about a lot, effect that the consumption habits of the millennial generation are having on the kinds of foods that are offered, well, in cafes. Here's a recent controversial one. Did anyone see this? This is a deconstructed smashed avocado from Melbourne, straight to you from Melbourne. I think it's more than $12. I think it's probably about $25, the deconstructed smashed avocado. And it will, if you decide to eat this way, it will, prevent you, presumably, from owning property in the long term. So that's just one example. But maybe for a slightly more interesting example, consider the effect that the increased knowledge and awareness about the importance of fresh food and healthy food has had on the behaviours of the fast food giant McDonald's. And if you think about how much they've changed their approach to offering food, think about their latest slogan, which is, "How very un-McDonald's." So it's a weird day when a company starts advertising itself as not itself. Or think about the way that the egg and chicken industries have responded to the demand for an improvement in the living conditions of chickens. So what I'm saying is that while not the only or even necessarily the best way to effect wide-scale change in the way that we produce, consume and distribute food, making well-informed and wise choices in the way that you purchase and consume food can still have a significant effect. Okay, but you might think, well, how does any of this help with the future of food? What can a philosopher offer here? So sometimes there are clear and compelling arguments about what we should and shouldn't eat. Sometimes there are cultural reasons for eating or not eating certain foods. But mostly there's just an enormous amount of information that can be overwhelming. And a lot of the time it's just not immediately clear what it is we should think or believe. And that's, in light of that, what it is we should or shouldn't eat or buy. So learning to do philosophy helps us to develop this practical wisdom that I've spoken of. The willingness to search out reliable information, to question the orthodoxy, to evaluate the evidence and to formulate conclusions based on good reasons. In sum, to seek truth, or at least to seek what it is we have best reason to believe. So developing the virtues of mindfulness, moderation, courage, commitment and care can help us act on our beliefs and our values to do what it is that we think is the right thing. So philosophy can't always tell you what you should eat, but it can tell you how you should eat, how you should be disposed towards thinking about food. Make your choices about food for good reasons, make your food choices mindfully, and make them an expression of your care, your courage, your values and your commitments. Right, that's enough from me. I'll put you on to Ruby.
Thanks, Nin. So Nin's spoken somewhat abstractly about philosophical concerns related to food. So what we thought that we'd have me do was, since it's not always clear to us how much of the public knows about what philosophy is and what philosophy does, I always find the easiest way to get into it is just to try to do some. So what I thought I'd do is just discuss two influential arguments, two influential philosophical arguments related to food, in particular related to the distribution of food and also the production of food. Now, let me just hedge a little bit. I didn't invent these arguments, and I actually want to be a bit cagey about whether I myself endorse them. So all I really want to do is the two arguments that I'm going to discuss, and the ones you might have come across if you know, back when we started teaching, students came in knowing nothing about philosophy, but now with the internet, we have different, there are different degrees of knowledge about these things. So it wouldn't surprise me if a lot of you have come across these arguments. But they challenge common sense, pretty bluntly. And so I'll present the arguments to you as simply as I can. And I will indicate lines of reply that people have offered. But my real goal is just to get you thinking about this and getting you to see the value of philosophy, and leaving it open how these whether these arguments are sound and whether they can be resolved in one way or another. So those are my hedges. The two arguments will concern, one I said concerns distribution. So one is an argument about whether or not we, either collectively as a political community, but I think the argument is usually put to us as individuals, whether we as individuals have any kind of obligation to alleviate hunger and famine. Most of us think that it's a very nice thing to do. If you donate surplus money to charity, that's a nice thing to do. But if you don't do it, you haven't wronged anyone. This argument attempts to establish something stronger, that in fact, if you've got surplus wealth and people are going hungry, it's wrong of you to not do something to ameliorate the hunger. And the other concerns the treatment of animals. So the question of whether or not our treatment of animals in the production of food is morally justifiable. So I'll talk about two arguments related to these things. The first one was popularized by Peter Singer, and it comes to, I think the first appearance of this was from his 1972 article, Famine, Affluence, and Morality. But he talks about this argument in other publications. One, and in fact, the way I'll present the argument to you resembles the way he presents it in his book, Practical Ethics, which first came out in 1979, but has a recent third edition from 2011. Now the argument, again, some of you might have come across this before, the argument starts with a thought experiment. And by the way, both arguments, and this is something that philosophers generally do try to do, they usually start with something that they think they'll get a lot of agreement upon. And then from there move to something more controversial. So the idea here is that the general thought is that our moral thinking is in conflict with itself in a lot of ways. And what philosophy, one of the things it tries to do is help us resolve the conflict. So these arguments aren't trying to come completely from left field. They're trying to start with values that they believe the audience will share. And so this thought experiment brings out one of these values that Singer, anyway, and his allies think that we share. And this is the thought experiment of the shallow pond. And so you're to imagine that you're walking by one day, there's not many people around, you walk by a shallow pond. You know this pond well, maybe you waded in it before, it's very muddy. But it only would come up to about here on you if you were to wade into it. But you notice that there is a child has wandered off from somewhere, there are no adults around, but it's struggling in the pond, and it's too deep for the child. So you realize that if you do nothing, this child is likely to drown. Now you don't have time to kick off your brand new shoes, which you've paid a lot of money for. Let's say, I don't know, if they're Air Jordans, they'd go for about $300, $350. There's not enough time to kick them off if you're to save the child. So jumping in to save the child would, it's something you could do. It would be no danger to yourself, but it would come at a cost that you wouldn't be able to recover. Now, presented with this case, Singer and his allies generally expect that their audience will think that if you were to just say, oh, look, this is terrible, but these shoes, and walk on by, that you'd have done something seriously wrong. Is that something you guys would agree with? Can I? Yeah? Okay. So that's supposed to be the starting point that gets you into the argument, the shared value that we expect the audience to have. Now, one of the things that philosophers try to do is, one thing we want to know is what things are right and wrong, but we're also interested in explaining, well, what is it about certain actions that make them wrong? And so here, Singer offers an explanation. Why is it that it would be wrong to pass by the drowning child and not help? And on the basis of the thought experiment, he frames a principle that he thinks might explain this. And the principle goes something like this, and I'll call it P1 because this will serve as the first premise in an argument. Remember how I worded this. So Singer thinks that why we think it's wrong is because whenever it's in our power to prevent something bad from happening or something very bad from happening, and we can do it without sacrificing anything of comparable moral significance, so your shoes are not of comparable moral significance to human life, well then we ought to do it. So if the pond had been teeming with alligators, you might not want to say that the person was wrong not to jump in and would come at a great risk to themselves. But in this case, the only real risk is to the beautiful new pair of Air Jordans that our agent has. So that serves as the first premise. And this is a very important premise, because what Singer thinks is that if we take this seriously, it's going to have implications that will be at odds with what we think common sense morality often requires of us in other situations. Second premise is one that he also thinks will be uncontroversial, which is that suffering and death from hunger, from lack of food, is a bad thing, or a very bad thing. Here again, he thinks this is something that you wouldn't expect most audiences to dispute. If anything is bad, suffering and dying from lack of food is bad. I say etc. because you could also run this argument with respect to lack of shelter or medical care and the like. Third premise is, there's famine around the world. I believe Sudan right now is experiencing a famine as one location, and there are organizations you can donate to that will do something to ameliorate this. So it is now within our power, when I say our, maybe ours collectively, but even yours if you have some surplus wealth, to prevent some suffering and death from lack of food. And you could do it without thereby sacrificing anything of moral significance. So if you're like me, you own some things that you can do without. I actually want to start naming all the things that I've bought that I haven't put to good use. But most of us do own things that we could do without. Or even if you've gotten the nice model car, you might have gone with the slightly lower model car, and you'd have some extra surplus wealth. And it's in your power. You could donate some of this stuff, and it could conceivably save lives. And so from these three premises, the conclusion is, well, look, if you took it, we agree that suffering and death from lack of food is bad, and it's in our power to ameliorate some of this, to prevent some suffering and death from lack of food without sacrificing anything of moral significance. Given this principle, what we ought to do is act so as to prevent some suffering and death from lack of food. Now, the conclusion might sound not so confronting because, well, yeah, we could do some of this. But the idea here is that this argument, even after you make a donation, the argument reasserts itself again. There's still people suffering from lack of food. And maybe you've given some surplus wealth, but do you have more to give? And if the answer is yes, then the argument runs itself again until essentially the thought is we're obligated to donate everything we don't really need to alleviate hunger. So from this very simple thought experiment where there's a lot of consensus from the shallow pond thought experiment, Singer tries to weave an argument that suggests that we have a very strong and pervasive obligation to alleviate hunger. And by the way, this argument doesn't depend upon, if you have political concerns about whether it's just to confiscate people's wealth to give to others, this can be seen as just being directed at you as an individual, not saying whether or not taxation should work for this purpose. Although you can run the argument that way. It could be just put to whether you have a right to keep your money or not, is it the right thing to do? So that's the argument. And as I said, there's quite a lot of dispute about whether this argument is sound. And let me just, I suppose I can indicate some ways that people have resisted it. One is, so by the way, in philosophy, if you disagree with an argument, there's really two things that you have to show. One is you might argue that even given the premises of the argument, the conclusion doesn't actually follow. That's a question about logic. I think in this case the conclusion does follow if you were to accept the premises. So the next question for us is, okay, well, should we accept the premises? Are there any premises of the argument that we reject? And one thing you might do is you might actually question how much power we really have to alleviate hunger. So some have argued that aid organizations are inefficient or they're ineffective, or that they would only alleviate short-term hunger, but they would leave further long-term problems. So that's an area where people have disputed the argument. For what it's worth, there are organizations that measure the effectiveness of aid. So if you haven't heard of any, there's one that has a website called givewell.org, where they actually rank and score charities. So people who are looking to donate money effectively can at least find that as a resource. That's one thing you might say. Another thing that some philosophers have argued is that Singer draws this principle from the case of the shallow pond, but it's not the only principle that you might draw. So some people think that, look, what we really should have concluded is that whenever it's in our power to prevent something bad from happening in an emergency, without sacrificing anything of importance, we should do it. But the thought is, world hunger is a chronic problem rather than an emergency, some philosophers have argued. And so the real principle we should have drawn from it doesn't require us to address world hunger. Now, there are rejoinders to this too. There's a question about whether or not the distinction between emergencies and chronic problems is really so sharp. So, when you look at a chronic problem, there are a lot of individuals for whom that is an emergency. So when you're going hungry, that's an emergency for you. But it's just one more piece of the chronic problem. All right, so maybe that's enough about this. So what I really was interested in doing is just giving you an example of a philosophical argument that starts from a commonsensical position, but sort of ends up in the end challenging our common sense beliefs. And it is challenging because most of us think we're fairly decent people. I think my mom and dad are fairly decent people. But if this argument goes through, it turns out that they've acted really, really horribly wrong all their lives by spoiling me with all the toys and Nintendos that I got spoiled with. And so the argument is both, in some sense, grounded in common sense, but also confronting and challenging of common sense as well. But as I said, it's not that surprising that our moral convictions are somewhat in conflict with themselves. And one of the goals of philosophy is to try to help us be more consistent. And there are different ways to resolve the consistency. I mean, when I talked about some of the responses that people offer to the argument, those are just other ways of resolving what the apparent inconsistency at the start. All right. So that was one argument that philosophers have used to confront commonsensical ethical thinking. The other one, our treatment of animals. By the way, I feel sort of bad doing this stuff because you guys are so nice to come and you're our guests. I don't want to shame you and make you feel bad. But again, really just trying to give an advertisement for what philosophy does and what it can be useful for. And again, not saying whether I myself endorse these arguments. So Nin had already shown you images of factory farming. So let's just start with that. A lot of the way we get our food, our meat, comes from farms like this, where animals, in this case pigs, are kept in confined spaces. I don't want to overdo it, so I won't go into too much depth about how much they suffer. If you are interested, you can find videos on YouTube. PETA, whether you love them or hate some of their methods, they've got one called Meet Your Meat from the early 2000s. It's about 12 minutes long. So I'll leave that to just say that the animals do seem to suffer quite a lot in the food production, in the production of food, in particular meat, and dairy as well. Now I take it that all of us here will agree that it would be wrong to subject human beings to this kind of treatment, confining them in these sorts of spaces. It's not that as far as I know, no one's ever mass-produced humans for food, but we have certainly, in things like the transatlantic slave trade, you did have people being treated in this way, put into those kind of confines, left to sleep in their own excrement. So we have treated people this way. Most of us now think that our ancestors who did this were behaving horribly badly in that way. At least I'm going to take that as a commonsensical consensus view. Even if slavery continues around the world, at least most of us think that it shouldn't. So it would clearly be wrong to subject humans to such treatment. What makes it okay to treat animals in this way? What gives us in this room moral rights that animals, and by which of course I mean non-human animals, we are animals too, but animals like cows, pigs, and chickens. What is it about us that gives us moral rights that animals lack? And so philosophers are interested in this question, of whether this question really has a satisfying answer, for one. So the question here is, what is needed to have moral rights? And by moral rights, I kind of don't want to sharpen it too much, but just to be the kind of thing to which some minimal amount of respect is owed, so that your suffering is something that agents have to take into account when they act. One thing you might go for is, well, you say, well, look, we're members of Homo sapiens, they're not. That's the difference. That's the difference that makes it okay to treat them one way rather than another. Now, philosophers argue about this, and a common complaint about this answer to what would justify the differential treatment is that this looks just blatantly chauvinistic. The mere fact that we're all members of the same species and they're not just looks like a kind of irrational bias, a kind of chauvinism. Can I say something? So that's one objection. This is just a kind of chauvinism, but about species rather than, say, ethnicity or gender. And it has no more rational basis than chauvinism about species and gender. There's another way of thinking about this, and I really think it gets at the same point, which is, well, look, it can't be that what makes it okay to treat those beings this way is that they're not Homo sapiens, because it might just be, first of all, it might not even be true that we are the only beings with our kind of cognitive capabilities. So the thought here is, if we ever came across intelligent non-human life, suppose this is life that has a language, these creatures, suppose we can recognize that they have emotions, they fall in love, they write poetry, they have forward planning, they think about the future. It seems like most of us wouldn't come across them, and suppose they weren't posing any threat to us, we wouldn't say, but they're not humans, wonder how they would taste. Many of us would think that if we came across beings that were like us in respect to their cognition and the way they socialize, that we would think that they probably had moral rights too. I don't know, maybe you guys would fry up Yoda if you came across Yoda. Of course, he'd be a hard fight. So, in any case, a lot of philosophers have been convinced that mere membership in Homo sapiens can't be the answer. But look, some of what I've said about the aliens sort of points the way to what it is about us that might give us moral rights that animals lack, namely certain cognitive capacities we have. So, for instance, some people, and here's just a list that philosophers have pointed to, the fact that we have language, animals don't, might be the difference maker. And here, there's not just a brute appeal to species membership, because this is something, having a language is something that intelligent non-humans could have. Being capable of rational deliberation might be something that separates us from the animals. This might be the sort of thing that plausibly would be the kind of thing that would grant us moral rights that perhaps lower animals don't have. Free will might be something we have that they don't, and it might be the sort of thing that justifies differential treatment, even without having to be chauvinistic about it. It seems like a morally important characteristic. Similarly, we don't normally hold animals responsible for the sorts of actions that they do. So when male lions or chimpanzees commit infanticide, we don't normally think that that's something that should be held to moral account. But with us, we do think it should be held to moral account. So beings like us are morally responsible for our actions. Maybe that's the difference maker. And our old friend self-consciousness. So we are conscious of ourselves as persisting through time. It's thought that most other animals don't have a consciousness of themselves as persisting through time. This might be the thing that grants us moral rights that they lack. What have I been doing? I've been listing characteristics that you might appeal to for justifying treating animals as though they don't have moral rights, whereas most humans anyway will, because we have these things, these capacities. So this isn't just merely, look, they're not the same species as us. It's, look, we have these capacities, and these capacities are morally important, and this is what justifies why we get protected by moral rights and they don't. So Earlier I mentioned Peter Singer. He made a kind of line of argument against this way of thinking, somewhat famous, but this actually goes earlier than him, about 200 years earlier. The British philosopher Jeremy Bentham has a footnote in his Principles of Morals and Legislation, where he talks about the treatment of animals. And he writes this, so starting with his conclusion. He writes, "The day may come when the rest of animal creation may acquire those rights which could never have been withholden from them but by the hand of tyranny." And here comes the kernel of an argument that a lot of philosophers have liked. He writes, and sort of the project we were just doing where we were trying to look for, what would be the dividing line that would show why humans have moral rights that animals don't. He says, what else should it be? What else should trace that insuperable line between the things that count morally and the things that don't? Is it the faculty of reason? Or perhaps the faculty of discourse, of language? But then he writes, but a full-grown horse or dog, and he might have said cow or pig, is beyond comparison a more rational, more conversable animal than an infant of a day, a week, or even a month old. So this is really just the kernel of an argument, but I want to, as philosophers, one of the things we have to do is we take some of these just little hints of an argument and we want to make them explicit so we can see if we think they're any good. So though he doesn't say it, I think Bentham is taking it for granted that, look, clearly human infants, we think, have moral rights. Most of us think it would be horrible, morally horrible, to treat them in the ways that we treat animals. And so we could start with a premise. Human infants have moral rights. Now, if they have moral rights, then it's got to be because of the capacities they have, certain capacities that they have, right? Once we've taken mere membership in Homo sapiens off the table as perhaps chauvinistic and perhaps not capturing why it would be wrong to harm intelligent non-human animals, non-human beings, if infants have rights, it's going to be because of some capacities. However, what Bentham was noticing, and what a lot of philosophers have endorsed, is that, look, in human development, those capacities come gradually. Most animals will have those capacities to a higher degree than human infants at some stage of development. So whatever capacities are making human infants have moral rights, they've got to be enough to make animals, like pigs and cows anyway, have moral rights. So if it's something like the capacity to feel pain, then pigs and cows, we think, can have that capacity as well. But if you set the bar too high, if you require that it be self-awareness, well then human infants are going to fall below that line. So whatever capacities human infants have, the thought is those capacities are going to be shared by the non-human animals that we often consume. And so we should conclude from that pigs and cows have moral rights as well. Exactly what moral rights they have? Well, that might depend upon what we want to say here. So this is an argument to say that we aren't, if this argument is correct, if it's sound, we aren't within our rights to simply treat animals as mere instruments for our own satisfactions of our own desires. They deserve somewhat more respect than that. Unclear whether the argument would require you to be an ethical vegetarian. It might just be an argument against factory farming. But in any case, it certainly confronts the way we commonsensically think about our obligations with respect. I mean, most of us eat meat and don't have a second thought of as to where it's coming or how it was produced in that respect. Now, as before, this is not an argument that everybody has taken, all philosophers have accepted sitting down. There are some, I'm ashamed to admit, there are some philosophers who are willing to reject premise one. They usually aren't happy about it, and they usually try to give other reasons why it would be wrong to harm infants that don't have to do with them having special moral rights. But some philosophers have bitten that bullet. But by far, the most common response is to go after premise two, to argue that we've been too simple-minded in thinking about the options for what might make for moral rights. A natural thing to argue is that, well, look, maybe human infants don't have capacities that different than animals that are manifesting themselves, but they certainly have the potential for those things through natural development. And then you get this argument over how much should potential for a capacity count morally. And it's a difficult question. Philosophers still argue about it. Another line of response, again, pressing it against premise 2, another line of response has to do with community, that moral rights may be gained by being members of a community of agents or rational beings. And if that's right, then human infants normally are part of human communities, part of communities of agents, even if they themselves are not agents. Most animals aren't. The argument actually might protect your pets much more than wild animals, but so they still, your dog might be part of your community as well. But that's another way that people have responded to this. But again, not here to try to persuade you of anything other than that philosophy has a use, and that this debate continues to go, it goes on now, and is an active area of research. So with that, I guess those were my parting comments. And I think we've run out of time.
Yeah, we have.
All right. Thanks.
Questions, I suppose?
Is it?
You don't have to say. If you have questions, you're welcome to ask. Bring the microphone across because it's being recorded.
Thank you. That was interesting. I'm not thinking about raising up animals in a confined area, but what do you think of raising an animal just for the purpose of being slaughtered?
Being what?
Just being slaughtered. Like you grow sheep or whatever, and then its destiny is just to be slaughtered. Like,
oh, just to be slaughtered.
Yeah.
Right. So we're talking about like free-ranged kind of.
Even if it's a free range,
Well,
you're like, you know what I mean? Like.
Yeah.
That's just looking at it from a different angle.
Yeah. So I mean, you're asking what I think. I'm going to tell you what I think people who like this argument think, because I haven't said whether I like the argument. Some run the argument again with. So what we might ask is, I didn't really specify what rights we were talking about, but you might ask, well, what about the right to life or the right not to be killed? You could run that same argument, but this time specifically about that, and the thought would be, if human infants have a right not to be killed, then animals have a right not to be killed as well. So not merely, so some versions of the argument have it that the conclusion is just that their interests need to be weighed up. So the idea might be that an animal who lives a life that is otherwise happy, if they're slaughtered in the end as painlessly as possible, we've done no wrong. And there are some people who run similar arguments like that who accept that kind of conclusion. But as I said, you can run this argument with respect to a right to life in particular, and you can end up with the same conclusion. So I guess you might have wanted to know what I think. I'm not really sure what I think.
That's even probably worse. I mean, it's probably worse than arguing of being in a confined place.
Oh.
I think just the fact that they're raised to be slaughtered eventually,
That's worse. That's even worse than being raised in unhealthy conditions. Or
yeah, I think there's dispute over this. I mean, some people might think the suffering, especially if they, given the cognitive differences between animals and humans, sometimes the thought is that actually the suffering is worse than the killing itself. Yeah. So people do sometimes take that line. Yeah, yeah.
But then if you look at the food web as well, then that's a normal cycle.
Oh yeah.
It is a normal cycle that some animals prey and live on other animals, and it's just.
Yeah, that's an important point that I didn't get to talk about before. Yeah, but I better let someone else ask a question as well.
Just on that, I mean, I think when you're trying to compare humans to other animals, do humans need to eat meat? No, humans have no biological requirement to eat meat. Vegetarians aren't dying. Whereas, when you say, oh, other animals eat meat, they need to eat meat. They're carnivorous. They would die if they didn't. And the reason why we're debating here is because we have the capacities to think about the suffering of the other animals. And the very fact that we're thinking about that, you don't see a lion contemplating whether its prey is feeling pain when it's killing it, which I think argues that, you know, we shouldn't be subjecting animals to this kind of suffering, and we're doing it in a completely different context.
So, I mean, so in a certain sense, you've responded to the other commentator. So, and I guess I'm happy to have you guys philosophize. Just to say one more thing, I mean, just an interesting thing that gets raised here is there's a notions of, we think that one of our capacities that we have that most animals don't have is agency, and which is why moral question. Earlier I said I can't remember how I put it, but moral responsibility falls upon us partly because we have agency and a capacity to stand back and choose. Animals don't. Some people have taken that as a reason to think that they don't have moral standing, but it doesn't have to go that way. But that is certainly a reason why you certainly want to hold carnivorous animals responsible for what they do, because they don't have agency. But the question so one of the questions for people who push this argument is agency and a capacity for free will really required to place restrictions on how you can be treated by other agents? So the thought is animals are what might be called moral patients. They're things that are treated by agents treat them in a certain way, but there's a question of might they have rights as patients even if they aren't themselves agents? So just to kind of flesh out a little bit of what you were saying, it's a good point to raise. Yeah.
Hi, I've got a quick question about premise 2 of the second question. Mm-hmm. Talking about capacity of what was the word again? Of moral rights, capacity of moral rights, as if it's a linear scale. Are there arguments against the idea that perhaps it is a linear scale? And there are perhaps categories of moral rights rather than degrees of moral right. Does that make sense? Am I answering?
No. I think it is. You might mean I'm not. There might be a few ways you're going with this. I mean, one is I think so. Certainly, the development of the capacities, like the capacity for self-reflection, it's got to be a gradual capacity. I mean, it's something that we ourselves get through gradual development. There is an interesting question about if you think that and most people do agree that you get new moral rights as you gain those capacities. But whether those moral rights themselves come in degrees or if there's certain thresholds that you hit, I think people are going to there's reason to want to go with the threshold view. At least at a certain point there's a threshold, because you wouldn't want to argue that someone like Albert Einstein has more rights than the rest of us because he's more intelligent or something like this. So it does seem like there will be a certain moral threshold. But yeah, you're absolutely right. The capacities have to come in degrees, and the moral principles have to be able to say something about that. Hey.
Hello. I'm just interested to hear your thoughts on why this argument seems to be not resonating in the current landscape of the food industry.
Oh, there's too much money at stake. I mean, look, it's to raise animals in a humane way. So even if we think it's okay to kill them, I mean, it would be horrifically, well, I say horrific, it would be very expensive. And I think, there's a market for cheap meat. And this is a problem, not just for this, in all of, and it's not just for moral philosophy, but I think, for anyone who deals with public policy issues, for each of us, we've got a collective action problem where we might all agree that this is a terrible thing, but on a day-to-day, look, you want to get the best deal. You don't want to pay so much more money than everybody else is paying, right? Like, so there's...
It's complacency.
Yeah.
Kind of think, well, we're too small.
The other thing I've noticed is I've got friends who are persuaded by the argument that it really is wrong to eat factory farm meat, or some of them are persuaded that it's wrong to eat meat altogether. I'm not saying whether I'm one of these people, but they continue doing it. And they sort of recognize, well, I know I'm behaving badly. But I think one of the tricky things is that when everyone else around us is behaving in a certain way, it's very hard to make the feeling of, kind of moral shame stick on yourself. No one else is really holding you to account. Well, 5% of people maybe, 5% of people in Australia are maybe, looking at you shamefully, but they're easy to ignore. And I actually think, and that doesn't make it right, but just as a matter of psychology, I would hypothesize that I think that sometimes has something to do with it. It's easier to do the right thing when you know others are holding you to account. And when others themselves aren't doing what the right thing might be, even if they think it would be the right thing, it's hard to stand out and make the sacrifice yourself. And it's also just hard too. It's hard to avoid factory farm meat. It actually requires going out of your way and being a pain in the butt sometimes to people who are trying to be hospitable to you, as when they invite you to their barbecue. So yeah, I suspect that those are some of the reasons. Again, I don't say they're justifying reasons, but just as a matter of psychology, I imagine these are some of the reasons why these.
The cultural thing that's a change.
Oh yeah. Yeah, we were just talking about the culture of eating earlier. So so much culture involves food. And I grew up Jewish, and so we have Passover, Seders, and all this. And so food is, knowing from my own culture, but I know most cultures, food is a very central thing. And if you were to say become persuaded by this or persuaded to become a vegetarian, you end up turning your back on parts of something that you actually value. And I think that makes it hard. Do you want more?
Hi, sorry, just a more kind of general question. Mm-hmm. Is there any kind of philosophical tools or concepts we can use to kind of help bring someone else to our side of the argument? For example, with that second problem and that the premise of like infants have rights that therefore like animals do, and then you were saying it can go a step further, infants have rights to life, therefore animals do. Even as a vegetarian, I find that like quite a logical leap. Mm-hmm. So I can imagine it would be quite difficult to persuade someone who is like a meat eater, like to be swayed by these arguments. Like it'll be easy for someone to just like who's not kind of converted as such to not be convinced at all. Is there anything that we can do?
Well, I don't even know if I want to admit this on tape. I mean, I'm quite pessimistic in some ways about this. First of all, let me say that I don't, and I haven't said for sure whether I think the argument can't have a rational response to it. Certainly there's the potentiality response that people offer, which is that, look, human infants at least have this kind of potential in the normal and natural flow of growth, that they will develop these capacities, and this is something that animals don't have, and this is morally important according to some people. And I think that I find to be a very difficult question to adjudicate, even with the tools of philosophy. But in some sense, one of the problems is that and earlier when I said that one of the things philosophy does is, we have kind of conflicted values, and it tries to help us resolve them and make them more coherent or more consistent. But there are different ways that one might make them more consistent. As I said, some philosophers have been willing to say, okay, I guess I'm willing to give up that infants have moral rights. If someone goes that way, it might be horrifying, but they wouldn't be guilty of being inconsistent. So I think, in some sense, there's a kind of psychological aspect to winning people over, and it's, you can't come at people very hard because they'll just put up a wall and they'll resolve the disagreement, they'll resolve the inconsistency in the other way. I tend to think that a lot of, when you're persuading someone morally, you're sort of, first you have to persuade them of your own character. They have to come to admire you. Yeah, well, that's more Nun's. But so, I guess earlier I said I'm a bit cynical or skeptical about the force of what can argument by itself accomplish. In some ways, I think it has its limits. It can't be the kind of tool that some people wish it could be, where they could really just with one powerful argument just change people's minds. I mean, people have to be willing to have their minds changed.
Yeah, because even with that last part, there was no obvious logical fallacies, but even so, it's very difficult to digest. Like that's kind of the conclusion that can be made. Yeah.
Hey, thanks everybody. Yeah.